Well, welcome to our next edition of Light Beer, Dark Money. I'm Sean Noble. This is Chris Clements, and we are very happy today to have Laurie Roberts, columnist for the Arizona Republic, and someone who's written a little bit about me.
A little bit.
I went back yesterday, and I think...
Did she give you the nomenclature?
She gave me
king, prince?
No, maestro.
Maestro.
A maestro.
Yeah,
Maestro.
I had not heard that. I had not heard maestro dark money.
Well, dark money maestro, it has a lot of alliteration. It sounds good. But I think for the purposes of today, if he's the prince of dark money, then I get to be the queen of lightness, right?
Yeah. Take it on.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
So this episode is probably going to surprise people because as anyone who watches Arizona politics would attest, Laurie and I have been on the opposite side of almost all issues.
Yeah.
Maybe not all issues, but I'm sure we can agree on something.
It's a gift. What can I say?
Right.
But our tag is agree on something.
Yeah.
And that's, we want to elevate the discussion and have folks in here who we might not agree on everything, but we can agree on something.
We'll find something.
Yeah.
I have a fond memory of Laurie. This must have been the 2006 cycle when J.D. Hayworth ran and lost to Harry Mitchell. Mm-hmm. And we were standing next to each other on election night, and you were quizzing me about certain things, and I think you were like, is he going to win? Because it was not known on election night because it was so close. And I think I said that I didn't think that Hayworth was going to win, and you seemed very surprised to hear me say that.
Well, I guess times being what they were, this was the representative for the Scottsdale-Tempe area, and pretty much a Republican area. You gotta work pretty hard to lose that if you're a Republican, and indeed he did.
Yeah, he did. He lost, and then that opened the door for Schweikert to beat Harry Mitchell in 2010.
Yeah.
So,
and we like Harry Mitchell.
Do we?
I did.
So I mean, he's a fine.
In my former life, I dealt with everybody, and I enjoyed most of our delegation. Even Raul Grijalva and I had a really great working relationship.
But the tenor of some of them has really changed.
Yeah,
you must
that's true.
admit that.
It's definitely not the tenor of the 90s. And
this is not the years of John Shattuck.
Yeah, that's right.
See, that we can agree on.
We found something already.
That absolutely we can agree on. John Shattuck was...
My history with Harry Mitchell was, at the time, my son, who was, oh my gosh, he's now way older, but he was reading going into kindergarten. Goes to kindergarten, and at Christmas break, I sit down, and his reading had regressed. And this was at the advent of all-day K. And I was like, oh my gosh, he's getting worse because he's not having time with his mom one-on-one, usually in the early afternoon when the other kids would be napping. So I called the school and said, can I have him half day? And they're like, that's not an option. And I was like, what do you mean it's not an option? Like, well, we don't have that option. And I'm like, that's crazy. So I called the district, and the whole story, so I decided I was going to run a bill that said, if you have all-day K, you have to have a half-day option for parents who want that. And the only person who, when I went down to testify, which I'd never done before, I mean, I'm a political operative, but I'd never testified at the legislature. And Harry Mitchell was the one who was really against it and pushed back on me.
Against having half-day K if parents wanted it?
Yep.
Wow.
I mean, I think it was a teacher union thing, so he was just, going with his constituency. Anyway, so I'm sure he's a fine man, but we were on opposite sides. That was a long time ago. Back when Mark Anderson was the sponsor of that bill. You'll remember.
Oh, yeah.
Mark Anderson.
Long time ago.
Yeah. So speaking of long time ago, so Laurie and I have known each other for a while, casually. But you've written a number of things opposed to stuff I've done. And I guess I'll start with what is your, like, philosophically, what's your opposition to dark money?
My opposition is pretty well can be boiled down to one thought, and this is post-Citizen United, where we found out that corporations are people, and they have the right to spend an unlimited amount of money, however much they want to, on an independent campaign for political purposes. And I'm fine with that. That the Supreme Court has decreed it. It says they can do it. It doesn't say they can hide. And I think that when a corporation or a person really can dump copious amounts of money into a campaign and dominate the conversation and dominate the airwaves, they have the right to do that. But I, as the consumer, as the voter, need to have the information as to who they are so that I can evaluate the message. Do I believe them? Do they have an axe to grind? Let's look at, what is the poster child for the whole dark money thing, and that's Arizona Public Service. In 2013/2014, unbeknownst to us, it was APS, but a pair of dark money groups put, $10.4 million into a campaign to elect a pair of corporation commissioners. The Corporation Commission, of course, being the regulatory body that sets our electricity rates and other things like that. So we didn't know who they were. One of the groups was called Save Our Future Now. So all of a sudden we're getting all this information from Save Our Future or Save Our Future Now saying, oh, you got to vote for these guys because these guys are going to be great for you. Well, I want to save our future now and in the future. So how do I evaluate that message? It became pretty evident pretty quickly that it was somebody who had a dog in that fight because nobody puts $10 million into a corporation commission race. Right. These are usually clean elections races that are nominal at best, and most people basically just vote party line depending on where they stand. Sadly, we shouldn't be doing that. It wasn't until 5 years later that we actually got confirmation that Save Our Future Now and the other group were actually being funded by Arizona Public Service. Now you ask the question, why would Arizona Public Service want to put $10.5 million or $10.4 million into a campaign secretly? Well, the reason probably is because they're basically choosing their own regulators. And no surprise, those same regulators were very quick to raise APS's rates, your rates, my rates, if you happen to be an APS customer, with virtually no discussion. And the reason that they did it is because they were in APS's pockets. As a voter, I believe that I had and you had the right to know who was sending me that message to say, elect those two people. Because had we known that, maybe we would have voted differently. Maybe we would have said, oh, no, we love APS. We want to vote for those guys. But we should have known it. Yeah,
I don't disagree.
All right, so we're done then here.
with where your head is on that in the regard. Now, and I look at this specifically because in this case you have a regulated monopoly, and you have its regulators, which you could make an argument about whether they should be elected or appointed, and it's, you're right. It clearly there's no one else who would have any kind of that level of self-interest in who the commissioners were, and it's similar. So in that case, it's like, okay, so should we say if you're a regulated monopoly that's governed by this commission that sets your rates, I could see an argument that says you shouldn't be participating in electioneering, or you're paying, whether it's dark money or contributions or whatever. Because it's similar to like the SEC doesn't allow hedge funds to get involved in governor's races because of the bond investments in different states. So I think you use it as the poster child, and I say, that's kind of the exception. In the sense of that's a pretty unique situation. I don't know that.
Well, let me give you another example. Not as specific, but in last year's election, Democrats on the federal level far outspent Republicans. They figured out what Republicans were doing back when you were doing it, and they've exceeded what you were doing. They spent, I believe, about $1 billion in dark money campaigns to get Joe Biden elected, to get Mark Kelly elected and to get a whole host of people on the federal level elected. Now, let's just and the way they do that, of course, is dark money means equals attack ads, because nobody wants to put their name on an attack ad, and nobody wants to be held responsible or accountable for what they say in an attack ad. So those are dark money ads always. So one of the people who was brutally beat up in dark money ads was Senator Martha McSally on ads that were taken out not by Mark Kelly, but by independent dark money groups who had, mom, mother, and apple pie kind of names, and they spent big money to attack her. So we heard what a horrible person she is. We heard in every different way how she's in Trump's pocket, which, frankly, by the way, she was. But the point is, we don't know who gave that money. Would it not have helped you as a voter evaluate the messages you were hearing and the attacks you were hearing on Martha McSally had you known that, for example, perhaps some of the money came from George Soros, boogeyman extraordinaire on the Republican side? Yeah. People had a right to know who was telling them that she was bad. And without knowing who the major contributors are, I just don't see how they can evaluate the message or what the messenger may have to gain or lose by that person being elected.
Yeah, so I view it as I think people, two things. One, if you hear a message, I don't think the first thing you think of is who is saying that. It is that true? And then if you care, you'll do some research on it.
How can you evaluate its truthfulness if you don't know who's doing the talking, if they're talking from behind a bush?
I mean,
your average reader or your average viewer, your average listener, your average voter is not going to go out and do a bunch of research.
Well, that's my point, is that if it is something that's going to affect them and they question whether it's true or not, if they care, and so that's going to be a very small number, are going to go, test the efficacy of that.
But why can't we help out the rest of them who need that information? Whether it's pro or it's con, whether it convinces them to vote for the person or not to vote for the person, it's information that they should have, and I don't understand why you're scared of giving it to them.
So it's not that I fear it. It's what, and this has only gotten worse as the tenor of our politics has gotten worse. Anonymity, in my mind, is something that is, I think, important because you should not be attacked for being a participant in the political process. From the standpoint of, I'll give you a couple of examples. The guy who was the CEO of Mozilla gave $1,000 to Prop 8, which was the campaign for marriage, to define marriage between a man and a woman in California back in 2006, 2008. Once that $1,000 contribution was disclosed, somebody picked up on it, and they just mercilessly attacked him. And it actually was the heat on that was so high that he actually had to resign his job as the head of Mozilla. I mean, top CEO, over $1,000 contribution, just because the mob didn't like it. A more recent example is there's a woman who runs a website and a blog and a business that helps parents with help getting their kids sleep trained. And she has a thriving business that has helped thousands and thousands of parents, including me. Her husband was a donor, gave, let's say it's $2,000 to Trump, and that came out, and she was mercilessly attacked, and people tried to ruin her business by taking her material and posting it out for free for people. That's the kind. I mean, so you say people have a right to know who's doing the talking. I think people care more about what the message is than who's giving the message, and I also don't think it's fair to tell someone you can't be in the political process, you can't use your voice unless you tell us who you are so that we can attack you if we don't like it.
Well, we live in politically perilous times, and the mob is a huge, huge problem. But I would also suggest that for the people who are attacked, they should, if they're being threatened, if someone's violating the law, they should pursue that in a court. But I do understand your larger point, which is the bit players in these things should not be held up to this degree of ridicule that we have in the community. I don't know that I would want to frame an entire campaign finance system around what I think is a problem that can maybe be dealt with in other ways, and perhaps by society becoming sane again. But I would say that the donors that I'm talking about are not the $1,000 donors or the $500 donors. If you look at the latest initiative that's been proposed by Terry Groddard and his group, the Outlaw Dirty Money People, they have a new name for it this year. But
I'm sure you'll be attacked as well.
Yeah, but if you look at that, they're after bigger dollar donors, the ones who can flood the airwaves where perhaps nobody else can even be heard. I don't think they're after the little old lady who gives money to the Sierra Club. But I mean, your point is taken. We are living in a terrible time. Believe me, I'm out there with opinions all the time. You should read my email.
Well, I can't imagine the amount of tax that you get, because I mean, you've got strong opinions, and they're to the left of at least half of the state, and maybe half your readership. But you do a very good job. I mean, you're very articulate and well written, well reasoned. Things, which is, I think, part of why, if you get attacked, it's in part because people, all they can say is call you names because they don't have a good counter argument.
Yeah, but I am troubled by that issue and what happened to the Firefox guy and those others. I just don't know that I believe that that's a reason not to require disclosure. And maybe the answer is you make it at a higher level. Though in those cases, those were not dark money groups. Those are just contributions to political candidates, as I understand it, which for time immemorial have been disclosed. I think that your concern has more to do with social media and just the times in which we live. So do we change our laws to put everybody in the dark because this happens to a couple of people on these high volume, highly emotional issues? I don't have an answer there. Mm-hmm. But I do know that conceptually and importantly, one of the things that voters ought to have is the right to know who's talking to them.
Well, you bring up another, both of you. I'm sitting back, I'm enjoying this. I think the overall point is that our politics have gotten so vitriolic to where, even the large donors, the small donors, nobody wants to be a target of the woke mob right now, whether you're left or right or indifferent. And in your perspective, you've been, share with us a little bit. You've been at this a long time, and this might be a larger question, but how did we get here? Like, from your perspective, how did we get to the point where, like, we're having a conversation, and we referenced earlier before we started recording about, the times of John Shattuck or John Kyle or whomever, and we could sit down and have a conversation about the issues that affect the state and actually come to some sort of consensus conclusion and move forward. But even in our own state, the delegation can't do that. You know what I'm saying?
Delegation is a symptom of the larger problem right now, in my opinion. But
sure.
We're at a time when you have a lot of people, especially in the middle class, who are feeling left behind.
Sure.
And I think that's Donald Trump spoke to them in a way that Democrats haven't. They had become somewhat elite. They have now become so woke, which is also an important thing because that's a whole other group of people that's been left behind. But you have a lot of people who have grievances, and you combine that with the fact that they've got the power of social media now, whereas in 2 decades ago, they could have called me up and I'd say, yeah, and maybe I would have written a story and maybe not. Now, as soon as you say something that's objectionable to me, as soon as you're you're the vice president and you go on Lester Holt's NBC show and you fumble an answer, you got the governor of the state of Arizona down on you, writing things online about how you need to resign.
For the record, he was down on her much farther.
Well, yeah, that's
much before.
But
I think when she
but my
was,
point is that everybody's got a microphone now,
Yeah.
and a lot of people are willing to use it. And there is this mob mentality on the left, and there is this mob mentality on the right.
Sure.
And the thing that really concerns me that I see increasingly is that now the two mobs aren't speaking to each other anymore. And so instead of having one place where we can go online and have conversations with each other in a respectful fashion, you've got the right wing that's got their own media now and even their own social media, and you've got the left wing that's got theirs, and neither the two shall ever meet. And so you got two echo chambers going. I mean, my writing buddy Eddie Montini and I used to talk about what happened when social media came along. And in the old days when we were columnists and we would write something, somebody might write into the paper a letter to the editor, and it would be, I don't like what that Montini said, and blah, 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 blah. But it was sort of like being in church, because it was usually respectful, and maybe there was some disdain there, but it wasn't too over the top. So that was like being in church. Well, now with social media, it's more like we're in the bar and it's midnight, we've had too much, and I'm going to take a bottle and I'm going to bam it over your head because I'm going to just take it out on you. And that's where we are in society right now, because everybody seems to feel disenfranchised for a different reason. And everybody has a grievance, and it's all your fault. And it's my hat's white and your hat's black, and I see that I even see that as a problem with the president now. I thought that he ran as a unifier, as a guy who was going to bring the center right to the center left people together, which is, I believe, most of the country. And instead, he's decided to unify the Democratic Party, which of course infuriates the Republicans. But again, my point is that I think there is room in the middle for compromise, and it's not something we ever want to talk about. Instead, it's I'm right and you're a jerk.
Right. Yeah. How do we get out of this? I mean, this is not. I can't imagine that this is sustainable. This level of strife, and how dysfunctional it's creating our politics. Is there a way out? Will something have to break?
Well, I'll tell you what I would like to see happen. I think that you have, building on what I just said, because we have such heavily gerrymandered political districts, the people that get elected are generally the people that come from the farther to the left or farther to the right, depending on which district it is. And so you get to the general election when you throw in the independents, who are a third of our electorate, and you've got two choices that are pretty far to the left or pretty far to the right from a center perspective. I really, if you assume that we can't get rid of the gerrymandered districts, which I've pretty much given up on. I started working on that in the year 2000, thinking that the Citizens Redistricting Commission was the answer, and it wasn't. I wonder if we couldn't morph to some sort of a top two primary, essentially electing our state and federal leaders much like we do our municipal leaders, which is where you have one free-for-all election and the top two go on. And so maybe there are two Democrats that go on, and those are your two choices, or maybe there are two Republicans that go on, and they're your two choices, or maybe it's one of each, or maybe it's an independent. But it forces those people to the middle, because you've got to appeal to the larger electorate. I mean, it's the reason that Martha McSally couldn't get elected, because she never tried to establish a more center position, and so she was rejected twice.
Right. I guess I'd have to look and see what has happened in California as a result of top two. If their legislature is more united. The problem is that it's so democratic. Like, I think they've got a supermajority. It'd be hard to do that analysis, right?
Right. And I don't know, because I know that there are concerns that people will say, oh, then I end up with two Democrats to deal with. Well, maybe you do, but one of them, I'll guarantee you, will be better than the other, and that's the person who probably wouldn't have made it through the primary to begin with. Better than the other from a center perspective.
Right.
But I think, don't forget that we're a state that has a third Republicans, a little over, third Democrats, a little under, and a third independents. And those independents are largely shut out. So I think that if we figured out a way to restructure our politics, why is it that if fully a third of the voters in this state, and in many states I would assume, are independents, why is it that we're subsidizing partisan primaries that essentially shut out those people?
Yeah. I remember there was a move, there was a ballot initiative, I think, a while back that was to create open primaries. And I think the compromise, I don't know whether it never got to the ballot or if we defeated it.
I think dark money killed it.
Did it? Dark money, that was before my
Well,
that was before I was
and in that case, both parties are against it, which probably makes it a pretty good idea.
And I think what ended up happening is the legislature referred, or something happened where we allowed independents to decide which primary they wanted to vote in.
But a lot of them that I talk to, either they're independent because they're sort of apathetic, or they're independent because they're truly independent, and they don't want to ask for a Republican ballot or a Democratic ballot because they may want to vote for one Republican guy and one Democratic woman,
right.
And they can't do that. Plus, they have to each year, if you're on the early voting list, what used to be called the permanent, was the PEVIL, now it's the evil. If you're on that list as an independent, each election cycle, you have to actually contact the Secretary of State's or the county recorder's office, right, and tell them which ballot you want, whereas a Republican or a Democrat is just going to automatically get their ballot. So I think that the turnout levels are quite low. And I think they could go up if we just simply included them more. That's to say nothing of how difficult it is for an independent to even run, because they have to get so many signatures to get on that general ballot for November.
Right. It is a
But what I guess I'm saying is that I think our system, from redistricting to the way we elect in partisan primaries, is set up for the extremes. And most of us aren't those people, and yet they run. I think they run at least 3 of our 4 Republican or congressional districts, and I don't think that they're that representative of their entire electorate. They're representative of the portion of their electorate that votes
that got them through their
in those primaries.
Right. What's your take on? Well, let's unpack things. Obviously, I believe that Joe Biden is the duly elected president of the United States. I'll just say that.
You know, it's amazing how many Republicans won't say that.
And you know, everyone who's focused on Maricopa County and this audit and blah blah blah, and and I've said this probably before on the podcast. What I always point to is, okay, so Joe Biden won Maricopa County by 20,000 votes. He won statewide by 11,000. Wins Maricopa County by 20,000 votes. So if Maricopa County was the place where it was stolen, that means there had to be at least 20,000 votes that were stolen. Adrian Fontes, the county recorder at the time of the election, a Democrat, lost his recordership by 4,500 votes.
Yeah.
So you're telling me he stole 20,000 for Biden, but didn't steal 4,500 for
Not
himself?
a very smart man.
Well,
Not a very smart
and we
candidate.
talked about the hottest race in Maricopa County, which was the county attorney.
Yeah.
And she won.
Yeah.
The Republican won. And she was behind. So that if you're going to steal votes, that would be where you go to the George Soros issue.
Yeah, it just is so absurd. So,
but I'm going to ask you a question here. How do you think all of this plays out for Republicans in 2022, as they continue to be this faction of the party tends to be so focused on this 2020 election, and most people in the state, 55%, I think the high ground poll said, find this to be ridiculous and want to sort of move on, and many of them are saying, I'm not voting for somebody. I'm going to be less likely to vote for that person if they supported this audit. How does this play out in a year when you're trying to regain a Senate seat and hold on to a governor's chair and hold on to the legislature, which you have a 1-vote margin in each chamber?
I'll start by saying it's problematic, but I'll caveat that by saying I think of swing voters who will make a difference in the elections in 2022, none of them even know about this. They're just not paying attention. They're not actively, they don't read the newspaper, they don't watch the news. Stephen Shattuck.
But they don't even vote in midterms usually.
Well, so there are I'm talking about two different sets of people. Those are two different sets of people. There's the less likely voters, and then there's what Stephen Shadid called the indifferent voters. They're the ones who don't pay attention until right at the end. And
the last 2 weeks of the election.
Yeah, or even the last few days.
They can swing it one way or the other.
And you have a close race. Those are the people who are going to make the difference. The people who are paying the least amount of attention. So as much of a clown show as the audit has become, it's going to motivate the Democrats to use it against Republicans, and that's probably not going to help Republicans. But I don't view it as something that's going to be catastrophic for the party as candidates across the board.
What about to legislative candidates?
Probably some
and
legislative
gubernatorial.
candidates.
It will be an issue there simply because Katie Hobbs is in the race.
Yeah. I'm not sure how that's going to play out. I mean, obviously Katie Hobbs is leading with that. She's like, I'm the adult, and she's going to have a strong message in that regard. And
she's now a household name. Nobody knew who Katie Hobbs was before this. Now you can't turn on the cable TV without seeing her.
Right.
Yeah. So she should probably write a thank you note to Karen Fann, the Senate president.
Right.
On this issue, she's definitely in the driver's seat in terms of exploiting it.
Yeah.
No doubt about it. How much this election is nationalized through the actions of Joe Biden and what's going on in Washington will be interesting. It'll be interesting to see after the summer of discontent.
Well, this could
I
be
think it covers everything.
This could be 2010 all over again.
Yeah, if he pivots. I don't think he will, but this next month is not going to be helpful to him legislatively. And we just saw it. We just had this discussion before you came about Kyrsten Sinema and Joe Manchin and the middle basically sitting back saying, okay, you guys do what you want to do.
Come increasingly clear. If you assume he's not going to get anything done next year, and
he's going to try to give his people something to go with.
Well, I don't think he's going to get much, because if he can't get beyond the filibuster, I just don't see the votes. And I see the Republicans are going to line up against anything he tries to do, as vice versa when Trump was in.
Yeah.
Democrats did the same thing. There aren't any angels here.
No. And what was Byron York had a great article the other day in his daily memo. The Democrats used the filibuster over 300 times over the last, in 1 year.
It has become a problem, though. I mean, I support the concept of a filibuster because I think, for the same reason we've been talking, it's important to get something that has a broader support than just being rammed through by one side or the other, and then 4 years later when they're out, being rammed back out.
I agree.
But I do think that it's problematic when you just have a minority who can just sit back and say no to everything. They ought to have some skin in the game. I don't know if we ought to go back to a Mr. Smith goes to Washington thing, or say.
You're talking about a real standing.
Where you really have to stand there and do something other than just sit back and go, no, we're not going to allow that, because that's really easy. But, I mean, I look at this issue and wonder, here's Kyrsten Sinema, somebody who's had no power. She's been slaving away in Congress for years, has had no power. Now she's got a lot of power, she and Manchin, and they're refusing to use it. It seems to me that if you really are that person who says, I want to get things done for Arizona and I want to be bipartisan, then you ought to recognize at the moment there's nothing bipartisan going on and do what you can to force people to the table. And it seems to me situationally, if you could say, if they won't negotiate something on this, then I'm going to vote to suspend the filibuster for this particular issue, which would force them to come to the table and compromise, or they get something worse. But pretty much she's just saying nope. And I wonder at some point, is that just an excuse to not have to take a vote on anything controversial?
Well, I mean, that's a possibility. I think that.
I think Kyrsten is very smart, and I think I think she knows exactly the power that she has, and I think she knows where she comes from.
But she's not exercising any power.
Well.
She's just allowing the Republicans to say no.
Well, I think.
Well, I mean, no on bills that we can argue would be detrimental to the country.
Or you could say if you assume that there is some germ of a good idea in those bills that something needs to be done on immigration, on voting rights, on whatever the issue is, if you think there's something good there, which she does on the voting rights thing, force them to the table to see if they can come to a more reasonable conclusion.
If you can parse out the pieces of the bill that can get passed with bipartisan majorities, that would be something.
But she's not trying to what I see, because the only way that you're going to get Republicans to even come to the table and consider it is to say, I might let the filibuster go on this. And likewise, to say to the Democrats, I'm going to stand with the Republicans if you won't come off of some of this stuff.
The question is whether you can be selective to that extent with the filibuster. Or
it's a rule. Why couldn't you?
Once you blow it up, is it blown up forever like it was with the
judges? If it's a rule, why can't you do it selectively?
I don't know. That's a nuance of Senate arcane rules. I was never a Senate mouse. I was a House mouse, not a Senate guy. So.
Well, yeah, it's a tough thing, but here we sit year after year. I mean, how many years is it going to be before we can solve the immigration issue? How many years?
That's a great question, because I
you worked on it.
I worked on
20 years ago.
Yeah, and it blew up pretty bad in 2006. That was
that's a whole nother podcast, right?
Oh my gosh, that's a serious
podcast. But to your point, no one has the courage to run a singular bill on immigration issues that probably everyone will agree on. So we have something here in the state of Arizona called E-Verify. If E-Verify was nationally implemented, that would you'd probably get the votes for that. But it's so because of the vitriol, because of the different interests. You can't even get a singular bill on E-Verify.
The problem is that the border hawks won't do anything to deal with DACA or a path to citizenship.
But if you could just start there,
because you have to secure the border first.
But they won't, for the same reason that the dreamers still are dreaming.
Yeah.
Because nobody wants to let their leverage go.
Yeah.
It's
We
disappointing,
agree.
disconcerting.
Yeah,
we agree.
There you go. Of course, the devil's in the details of how you decide the issues, but I don't see any possibility of dealing with any of these issues until we can get a set of elected representatives who are more representative of the entire electorate as opposed to just the extreme members of their parties.
Yeah, I think so. I agree that that's definitely the case in Congress, but how do you? I mean, in the Senate, I guess it's just a matter of
it's 50-50 there, so they're pretty.
But then I guess I would argue it would take real leadership on the executive side, which we haven't had in some time. I would say last administration, this administration. So you have the border. You have an issue with border security. You have a 50-50 Senate. You have a 6-vote, margin of error in the House. Biden could have come in and said, we're not messing with border security. We're going to continue to do what Trump's been doing. Seems to be doing what worked. Because the only way I know I can get any sort of bill through on any sort of compromise is not blowing up border security. But instead he goes totally, to your point, the opposite direction. Because it was
wanting to appease the most progressive wing of his party, which I understand, except
but
it's
now
a different message
it's a
from
crisis.
the center. Well, they shouldn't have done anything until they had an asylum system put in place. It's crazy to just open it up. And for as much as he doesn't want to call it a crisis, and as much as they don't want to say that it's something that they had a hand in, that they just inherited the problem, he certainly did have a hand in it, because people thought, we've got a kinder, gentler country with a kinder, gentler president. Let's go. And who wouldn't? I would, wouldn't you?
Yeah, and that's been my point about it overall in immigration, is that I don't for a second begrudge people who want to get here, because I would absolutely do the same thing. It says something about our country.
I tell my kids all the time that you won the lottery.
Yeah,
you won the world lottery. You're born in America, and you're here.
And so that leads me to that's a good segue to a question I wanted to ask you, Laurie. Was I'm it's obvious I'm a proud American, and I love this country. There are a lot of people who are really spending a lot of time trying to convince people that this country sucks. and we have a terrible history, and that I've always believed that this is the greatest nation on earth, because we are the only experiment in democracy that's lasted this long.
Well, I think we are the greatest nation on earth, but I think that your view of our history and my view of our history and what our forefathers experienced may be a little different from what other people experienced. And so is what they're saying we're a terrible country, or what they're trying to do is make us a better country? I view it as more they want to acknowledge the problems in our past, which we certainly had them, in order to build upon that and create a better future for their kids. And I think that's fair. I mean, my sons grew up with some children of color around them who were friends. And while they had great experiences, they were lucky kids, they also had parents who had a point of view that was a little different, because they had to be a little more careful with their kids. When they get to be 16 and they get the driver's license, they get the talk that I never dreamed of having with my children. So It just could be that our perspectives as pretty privileged people is different than the perspective of someone who has maybe a different skin color. And I don't think that means that they're any more ashamed of America as I don't think that it means they're ashamed of America. I think they're trying to build a better America.
Sure, and I absolutely would agree with building a better. I mean, we're the greatest nation on earth, and we need to get better. I mean, we have problematic history.
It's not just history, though. You see what's going on. Yesterday, there was a woman in a Jewish family in Tucson that had a swastika spray painted. I'm sure you saw the picture on their door, and something pretty nasty written underneath it. This is in Tucson, Arizona, in the year 2021.
Which is insane.
So it's not just our history. This stuff goes on now.
That's a good point. Look at Derek Chauvin. I mean, that was horrific.
And plenty of others.
Yeah, not the only one. Just the only one that was so graphically captured, thankfully. It just...
Did you guys just agree again?
I think we did.
A monumental, historical moment.
So one thing
we're going to have to send out a press release.
I will guarantee you that there's going to be people who attack Laurie for coming on this podcast, and there's going to be people who attack me for having Laurie on the podcast. I mean, no one's going to attack me. I'm friends with everybody. I just really, really try to be.
Probably. I'm responsible for anything a Democrat ever does, and I'm not even a Democrat. So, it's all right. It's all right.
Now, if you're Mr. Montini, I don't think we would agree on much.
Yeah, but I think that's okay too, because he would be respectful, and I think we need more conversations in this country and more opportunities to seek out middle ground, not fewer. But we have fewer for the very reason that you just talked about, because you are supposed to only have far-right Republicans on, I suppose, and I'm only supposed to talk to far-right Democrats, I suppose, and that's the problem. Used to be that you would read a newspaper, and hopefully you read a newspaper. Hopefully you still do, but probably not. And
I just read your column. That's all I really do.
Oh, well, there you go. That's all you needed to know. But you got to say the op-ed page, and hopefully there's something on there that is written from a conservative perspective, and maybe there's something written on there from a liberal perspective, and that's good. And hopefully you would read both and maybe learn something, or maybe you'd disagree, which is okay, but you'd have at least been exposed to it. And now you go to the blogs that you know are reliably only going to have uber conservative writers, and someone else goes to the blogs that are only going to have the woke people writers.
Yeah.
And there's no cross-pollinization at all.
Right.
And so we become an echo chamber, and everybody who reads me says I'm great, and everybody who listens to you says you're great, because the only people listening to you are from your perspective. If I disagree with you, you must be wrong.
Right.
Yeah. What I'm going to retell the story, and maybe she'd appreciate it. So when I was really into politics when I was a kid, and back in the election of 1984, I'd hate to take you all the way back, when in Tucson, Jim McNulty was the congressman, and he was defeated by Jim Colby. And my dad took me out to both the Republican and the Democratic parties that evening. And we went to the Jim Colby party first. And I was like, oh, this is great. Fine, Jim won. And I'd already met him, and
he's barely even a Republican anymore, is he?
he's
Based on
been canceled
where the party's
out.
gone, yeah.
And but Jim is still a dear friend. And then we went to the McNulty party. And as a kid, I'm like, why are we going to the McNulty party, Dad? And his response was great. And he said, because Jim McNulty is a good man. And we evaluate people not by their politics, but by their hearts. And I've never forgotten that. In fact, my first internship was working for Dennis DeConcini because of that sort of influence that my dad had on me.
But you would lose voters now.
Oh, I know.
For
You
that.
would.
I mean, think back to.
So I consider Kirsten Sinema we're friendly. I wouldn't consider her a good friend, but we've had coffee together. And we don't agree on everything, but we can be honest with one another. And that's so lacking in our discourse now. Just honesty and just being like, okay, well, that's what you think and that's what I think, and you want another cup of coffee because life's too short.
Yeah, well, that's where we are.
Yeah.
And neither side is to blame, and both are to blame.
Yeah.
Really, pretty much both.
I think it's both for sure. It's just gotten so toxic. What's the future of newspapers look like?
The future of newspapers, I think, looks great if you don't consider a newspaper the printed thing that gets thrown on your driveway every morning. I think it's online journalism. I think it's more important than ever that there be places that people can go that are written hopefully from not one perspective or another, but are what we expect of the mainstream media. Have we been perfect? Do we need to improve? No. Do we need to improve and redouble our efforts to make sure that we are fair and presenting things in an accurate manner? Certainly. But we are vitally important, I think now especially, when so many people masquerade as journalists. I look at some of the blogs that I see. All you have to do is just have some guy in your basement that knows how to set up an internet page or whatever they have to do, and then you've got the same voice as anyone else. But not all voices are equal when it comes to where you should be getting your news. And I think that we are going to do a better job. Journalists of the future are going to do a better job because they're going to be. It's going to be more important to not only just provide facts, but also to provide context and to say what that politician is saying is not true, and here's why it's not true. You don't have to take a position on it like I would do as a commentator, right. But they need to have the ability to they're not just secretaries taking dictation and putting down what you say. They should be providing context, and they should be providing, an honest look at what's being said out there, because I think we can all agree everybody's spinning everything. And so if you want to know where you can turn to for reliable information, it's got to be the mainstream media. So I think our future is bright. It's just different than it was when I came up. And someday, probably in the not too distant future, you're not going to have that newspaper thrown on your driveway if you're still getting it. But instead, you'll have a better product because you can go, they're now updated 24/7 all the time. When something breaks, you don't have to wait till tomorrow's newspaper to get it from our reporters. They may not always be first. I wish they were first more often than they are. But more importantly, they try to get it right, and to get it with enough detail and depth that you've got something there. So I'm pretty. I don't think I'll be around to see it, but it's good.
About
it's all good.
having to wait for the next day's news. So when I ran John Shattuck's first campaign in 1994, I would be at the office very, very late at night, usually wee hours of the morning, and I would stop at the Circle K between where the campaign office was and my apartment to pick up the next day's paper on my way home, because it would be 3 o'clock in the morning.
Yeah.
And that way I could get a jump on whatever issues. Not that there was that many issues that in a congressional race that the Arizona Republic was covering, but it was, I just felt it was part of my thing. But now I can roll out of bed and look at my phone.
It's exciting, but it's also really hard because, and you'll see it like when you have major breaking story, say a shooting, one of those mass shootings. Everybody wants to be out there immediately. Everybody floods the airways. Half of it's wrong because nobody even knows what's going on yet, even the police. But still, everybody feels compelled to just vomit out whatever they've heard. I heard from a third-hand source, and so there it is out there. And I think that newspapers, and to maybe a lesser extent TV stations, but certainly newspapers have learned to take a little bit of a breath and a pause before they put something out there so that you can know that when you start reading what we're writing, it'll be the right stuff. And inevitably, some things will be wrong because we'll have been told things that were wrong because the police will have assumed things that turned out to be wrong, or they spun them their own way. But you can also know that we're going to come back and make sure that you know that thing we told you before, that wasn't true, and here's what is true. So it's an exciting time to be in journalism. I remember when Gabby Giffords was shot, and there was tremendous pressure. Of course, I think it was a Saturday morning, and this thing had happened at a Safeway just north of Tucson, and nobody had information at first, and the information that came out was that Representative Giffords was dead. And some media went with that. But the responsible ones took a breath, took a pause, saying, no, we got to have another source on that. As much as we need to put out, we want to be first, we'd rather not have somebody killed off before they really are dead. And thank God she wasn't dead. And I thought that was one of our better moments in journalism, that we held off. And we just got that confirmation. So I think our futures are bright, because if people want the right information, if they want to know that they can go to a trusted source, that's got to be us. And clearly we're not that trusted at the moment by a fair amount of the country, so we got to earn that back.
Right. And I think that's going to be a challenge.
It is.
I think going back to your earlier point, with social media being what it is, and everyone is a reporter, everyone has a take, that creating a narrative for a specific story before the facts are all known seems to be more important than the facts.
Shouldn't be. You got to start with the facts.
It's all about what the narrative is. I think you saw that with what happened on January 6th. I think as we've gone farther away from it, there are a lot of crazy things that happened that day. But there was so much of a rush to the narrative, and now the narrative has dominated, sort of the politics. And it continues to dominate.
What was about that narrative that was wrong? What I recall was wrong was people like Paul Gosar saying this was Antifa, and it clearly wasn't. That part of the narrative was wrong, but what part are you speaking of that was wrong?
So you have, even specifically what I was thinking about, that the narrative that this was like an insurrection, and that seems to have dominated the mainstream media, and it wasn't an insurrection. I would disagree with that narrative.
They were breaking into the nation's capital in order to try to prevent Congress from certifying the results of the presidential election. So I don't know if the word insurrection is right, but it certainly is troubling.
No, I don't disagree with that. I just think that there was a definite rush in different areas of our media to create a narrative that as we get farther along. I mean, you've seen it with COVID. There has been a lasting narrative around different ways that we've approached the COVID pandemic. And as we get farther along, the responsible actors, what you're talking about, will report the facts.
Right, because you learn from it for the next time. But I mean,
but
the COVID thing was
the
science sort of evolved.
Sure.
And if you'd known everything then that you know now, perhaps things would have been different. But you're right. The fundamental first thing that a reporter ought to do is get the facts. Just get the facts. And but I also think it's important in getting, and that's on like a breaking news sort of thing. It's also important to put those facts into perspective as quickly as you can.
Sure.
But of course, that's where the danger comes in. I remember hearing, that Ashley Babbitt was this great patriot and she'd been murdered. Well, no, she was breaking into the speaker's lobby. Now, she may be patriotic, but I don't know that that's particularly a heroic thing to be doing, and breaking in when people are telling you, don't do this.
Yeah, the whole thing just is the most surreal bizarre.
Well, there's so many competing narratives there too. So you have her breaking into the speaker's lobby, getting shot, unarmed. You have a guard dying 2 days later of having a stroke, but the narrative was that guard had been attacked
that's a perfect example, because early on the police said, as I recall, that this police officer had been hit over the head
with a fire extinguisher.
With a fire extinguisher, and I assume that they were quoting witnesses, and so the narrative became that he was murdered by these people who hit him, who directly attacked him, and it took probably months, well, maybe not months, but weeks at least, to sort out what really happened, which was that, and then the thing was that he was tear gassed, and that wasn't true either. But what he did have happen to him is that he was involved in a lot of pushback with all of these people, and then 2 days later he had a couple of strokes and died. Were they connected? That's for someone else to say, but that's an example. But I'll tell you what, as soon as it became apparent, and it wasn't really even that long ago, that what had happened to that officer, it was prominent in the news, in the Washington Post and in the other places that were what would you consider the primary sources on a story like that. It wasn't like they tried to just hide it and continue on with the narrative. They went with the best information that they had at the time, which was from local authorities.
Yeah, I think that it will be an uphill battle. There's so much distrust of the media on both sides, so it'll be a challenge. It'll be interesting, but I think it has to be done because we do need to have a neutral source of information.
That's true, but also you can't. I as much as I want reporters and journalists and myself as well to redouble our efforts to be correct factually and to be correct in the spin that we give something. Actually, the reporter shouldn't be giving it any spin.
Right.
That should come from people like me. I also don't want them to become so timid because someone's going to scream fake news at them that they don't do the job. They should be pointing out. If we have a president that regularly lies, they should be pointing out that that's a lie. If we have a president who says without evidence that the election was stolen, the reporters ought to say, he says the election was stolen, but there's no evidence of that. And if we get to the point where we don't want our reporters to say that, then just go hire a bunch of secretaries to see what comes out of people's mouths and just write it down with no filter.
Right.
What do you think is the biggest challenge right now facing our state? Going into, we talked a little bit about going into the next year's elections, and
I think it's the differences in everything. Well, it's the differences in our income. We've got a lot of people that are comfortable and well off, and then we've got way more people. You saw it in the pandemic that are one paycheck away from the streets. We need to figure out a way to get them better, the educational opportunities that they need, and we need to figure out a way to get the kind of jobs that come in that aren't $12 an hour jobs so that they can support their families. And I think that we need to reconsider the whole tax structure in this state. We need to spend more money on things like schools, the things that will help change that. And right now, it seems like if you look at any graphic of income in this state and in this country, a few people are doing really, really well, and a whole lot of people aren't. And I think that's our biggest problem, and it goes into the areas of education, and it goes into the areas of people being angry with each other, and it goes into just about every area that we have. But we don't have anybody who's willing to tackle the issue because it might involve a tax increase for someone, or we've got Governor Ducey who proposed this flat tax, except it's not a flat tax. It reduces taxes for people at the lower end of the scale by an average of $39 a year, woohoo! While people at the higher end of the scale, it reduces their taxes by $7,000-8,000 a year. And it allows them to keep all the loopholes. So, where's the flat tax if you've got a tax system full of loopholes? I don't know if you saw the ProPublica piece this week where they got a hold of some of the tax returns of some of the wealthier people around, Jeff Bezos and all those people.
Yeah.
I mean, that guy Bezos is making zillions of dollars, and he got $4,000 tax credits for his kids.
Well, I think that and maybe that's a way to have the conversation about what is taxable income. The bottom line is that they didn't have, they may have had losses because all of his wealth is in the investment.
But because we only tax your labor, we don't tax your investments.
Right.
I get that,
assets.
but it has created a pretty inequitable system, and I don't know to the degree that trickles down to Arizona, but if you look at the number of people who are still hurting out of this pandemic, I mean, I wasn't that affected. I'm guessing neither of you were that affected in a financial way. Think of all the people who are being evicted from their houses. We've got a problem in this state, and we don't seem to want to deal with it structurally.
Well, I think we were talking
and I don't
about
have
earlier.
an answer, by the way.
I think
we can agree that we don't have an answer.
The bill coming due in terms of the lockdowns and the length and severity of the lockdowns, not just in Arizona, but across the country, is going to be coming due in the form of some of the things you're talking about. Income inequality, drug abuse, mental health issues. All these things have been exacerbated.
Mm-hmm. And the kids that lost a year of school.
And the kids who lost a year of school.
But again, there's that inequitable issue. The kids that lost the year of school are probably the ones who are one income, low income houses where the parents just weren't able to deal with this. Maybe they don't even have access to the internet.
The growing consensus is becoming the schools should have never been closed. Businesses should have never been closed for as long as they did. People have lost, and to your point, actually, I think is a great point, is, there so many of the people who lost their jobs in the service sector, they live paycheck to paycheck. I had this conversation with several of our elected officials saying, do not shut down the economy. There's things that we can do to mitigate. Don't shut. People in the restaurant business, in my former life, I knew a lot of those folks, and they are living paycheck to paycheck, mouth to mouth, and they are some of our most vulnerable. Mm-hmm. Protect them, and they're slowly coming back, and they need certainty. They need care. And
well, this will never happen again. I can't imagine that it would ever happen again. But you have to go back to where we were in March of 2020 and what we knew and what we didn't know. And there was a whole lot we didn't know. And you say we shouldn't have shut anything down. And I'd like to agree with you, except how many lives were perhaps saved because they did? How many
lives were devastated because we did?
Yeah, that's the thing.
That's true. It's a balancing thing, but at least you can come back from that. You can't come back from the grave. But your point is well taken.
Well, and there was just so much. We talked about this earlier that before you got here, Laurie. There's so much misinformation. There's so much people just didn't know. And then I think as we learned things, there was because, and it was just the whole damn thing got so freaking political. Because it was Trump and he had said certain things, you couldn't, if you were anyone that was on the left, you couldn't agree with that, no matter whether he was right or wrong. And it really led to some stupid things.
Well, he was wrong a lot.
Sure, he was wrong a lot.
Hydroxychloroquine, let's go the other way. Because Trump said it, we thought it was a good thing. You had Representative Andy Biggs pushing that stuff, saying, oh, yeah, this is going to be a great cure.
He actually tweeted at Trump when Trump announced he had COVID. Andy Biggs was saying, oh, you take hydrochloroquine?
Yeah, exactly. But, I don't understand how it became so political that, and it's still political. People yell at each other if you have a mask on, or they'll yell at you if you take your mask off.
I really think Trump was the issue there, because and the other issue is, and the reason it's still political, I think, is because people, for whatever reason, when they locked in on where they were going to be on this, even when evidence has said otherwise or things have changed, they have not changed. And the idea that if we're fully vaccinated, then why are we not having a mask? Or Fauci admitted
Well, it's
it.
become
It was
a
all
virtue
theater.
thing,
Yeah,
I think, to
People
some
are virtue
degree.
seeking.
And on the other side too, when this was still a raging thing, and we had one of the highest rates of community spread in the country, you had people carrying their Trump flags marching through places like Target, refusing to put them
Right.
on. It's in defiance. It's the same problem. Why couldn't we just as a community come together and as a country say, we got this big problem and it's going to affect people whether you're a Democrat or a Republican. So let's just do these reasonable things to try to slow this down. And all of a sudden it was like, no, if they tell you got to wear a mask, we're going to be wearing masks for the rest of our lives and blah, 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 blah. No, nobody's going to do that. Nobody's even going to do that now. But I think that the medical community acted upon the best information they had at the time, which was crummy information, and you evolve from there. But it just immediately became a political thing. And you're right, part of it is because it was Trump, but part of it was because Trump went out of his way to divide people on it. Why run around calling it the Wuhan virus and the Chinese virus when that's all that's going to do is cause people here who are in this country and had nothing to do this, who are of Asian descent, it's going to put the bullseye on them. And of course it did absolutely that. Why does he have to act that way? It's like he goes out of his way to be obnoxious.
Well,
Well,
I
he
think
does.
I think
he does.
I think you hit it.
It's his brand.
He was acting. The guy was never the president.
Well,
he was always the actor.
He sets the tone, the
No,
president.
there's no question.
Maybe someday we can say she sets the tone for somebody, but
Condoleezza Rice. Or maybe Nikki Haley. I don't know. Might be Kamala Harris. There should be. I don't know that we'll ever get to the bottom of all the different aspects of COVID, like how many people actually died of COVID only.
Yeah.
Well, but in some of those cases, if you had an underlying condition, it could be argued that the COVID carried you on along toward the grave a lot quicker than it might otherwise have.
I've called it the quickening. If you had those underlying conditions that were probably going to end your life anyway, it just sped it along.
Yeah, and we still
it's a harsh thing to say,
don't
but
have
it's
any
true.
feel yet for the long-term effects of this thing on some people. You hear about people with enlarged hearts and lung issues, and I don't think we'll know for a long time what the impact is going to be.
I agree with that.
I think here's the one thing that we can all agree on in America, and that's just we want it to be over.
Well, that's a great jumping off point because we can all agree on that. We can absolutely agree on that. And we just appreciate you being here today and
anytime. It's fun.
Discussing these big issues, and we'd love to have you back.
Sure.
And
thank you.
Certainly, as we get into the election season, we're going to be having some folks on that are going to be all over the board.
It's going to be crazy.
It'll be fun.
It's going to be
gonna be
crazy.
a
I think it's going to be
nuts year.
particularly interesting to watch the legislature because the Republicans control each body, each chamber by one, and that's nothing.
No.
Yeah.
As is going on right now, there's one holdout on the budget, and
Actually, one on one side and two on the other.
Yeah, right.
And they all want different things.
Exactly. Good luck. Well, thank you so much, Laurie.
Thank you.
Appreciate it. Hope you guys enjoyed this. Bye-bye, everyone.